This is a production of World Video Bible School. To God be the glory.
Hi, and welcome back to our study of 1st and 2nd Thessalonians. I'm Dan Cates. As we study together, I'll be using the King James Version of the Bible if you want to be able to follow along with me. I want to correct something before we move on in our study. In the last class session, I was talking about Aretas IV, the king of Arabia or Nabatea, whose reign extended to Damascus. And I gave some dates for the Emperor Caligula, and I gave those incorrectly. I gave the dates 37 BC to AD 14, and I had gotten some numbers off in my head. That should be AD 37 to 41. Herod the Great, actually, in Judea, began reigning in AD 37, reigned through 37 BC, reigned through 4 BC, and Octavian had been reigning in Rome from 27 BC to AD 14. So those dates got a little backward in my mind. So those dates should be Caligula reigned AD 37 to 41. As we were closing the last session, we were talking about the conference in Jerusalem, and I just want to emphasize one more time the point that conference did not decide doctrine. And so we don't have any scriptural authority for ecumenical councils, meetings, and so forth. Unfortunately, we see those still taking place in the world today. As we continue looking at the chronology of Paul in more detail, we see the events which really first start hitting Thessalonica. And that is Paul and Barnabas' second missionary journey. As we consider the map of that missionary journey, a journey which began around AD 49, we understand from reading about this between Acts 15:36 and Acts 18:22 that Barnabas would not be with Paul through the whole journey. Rather, Barnabas would join John Mark and would go into Cyprus, and Paul would then carry Silas with him into the region of Asia, Asia Minor, ultimately would receive the Macedonian call, to which we've already referred. As we consider this second missionary journey, we see that it went from Antioch, the same starting point as the first missionary journey, Antioch in Syria, to Derbe, to Lystra, to the regions of Phrygia, Galatia, and Mysia, all of these areas in modern-day Asia Minor. He's moving a bit farther west than he had gone with Barnabas in the first missionary journey. Ultimately, he's near the coast. He's in Alexander Troas, which was located in Mysia, and he received what we call the Macedonian call. In this vision, seeing the man of Macedonia saying, "Come and preach to us." So he received the Macedonian call and went from thence to Samothracia, which was an island in the Aegean, to the city of Neapolis, from there to Philippi, where he met Lydia, where he converted the jailer, there in Macedonia. And he, because of the threatenings there, and because he had been imprisoned and that threat continued and the authorities were happy to see him go, he moved further west and came to Thessalonica. So this is taking place sometime around AD 49. Moves from Thessalonica to Berea, also in Macedonia, down south to Athens, further south to Corinth, to Cenchrea, which was across the isthmus from Corinth, both of those located in Greece, back to Ephesus, which was located in the western side of what we call Asia Minor, and then from Ephesus to Caesarea Maritima, which was located in Judea, and then back to Antioch in Syria, where that second missionary journey had begun. Some important dates inside that journey. One of those is one of the benchmarks of the life of Paul and the chronology of Paul. We know from secular history that Claudius expelled the Jews from Rome in AD 49. When Paul met Aquila and Priscilla, we can consider Acts 18:2. Acts 18:2 says, "And found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them." What this indicates is that Paul could not have met Aquila and Priscilla prior to AD 49. He's going to be meeting them on this second missionary journey. And so that means that this missionary journey, and especially his time in Corinth, could not have started much before AD 49, and his time in Corinth and meeting them could not at all have been before AD 49. We see that it's on this second missionary journey that Paul welcomes Timothy into his traveling party. We notice this in Acts 16:3. Him, that is Timothy, would Paul have to go forth with him, and took and circumcised him because of the Jews which were in those quarters, for they knew all that his father was a Greek. So Timothy is going to be going with Paul, but he's going to be compelled to be circumcised. Now, he's not being circumcised for religious reasons. In fact, Titus, another young co-worker of Paul, is not going to be circumcised because he did not have a Jewish mother or father. So that Timothy could have more effective work among the Jews wherever they might go, he wanted for Timothy to be circumcised, since Timothy's mother and grandmother were Jewish. That's the only reason, not because of a religious obligation. There were those in the first century, though, we call them Judaizers, who wanted for converts to Christianity to be circumcised as the Jews were. It was not too long after this that Paul made his way into Macedonia, Thessalonica, and ultimately down into Corinth. Acts 18:1 shows us entering into Corinth. It's around this time that he writes 1 Thessalonians. Acts 18:11 says, "And he continued there a year and 6 months, teaching the word of God among them." Shortly after that, he's going to be writing 2 Thessalonians, probably during the same period of time, around AD 50, maybe into AD 51, while he's at Corinth. Now, we're going to talk more about when this book was written later in this study introducing 1 Thessalonians. Some have suggested that it was written from Corinth. Others have suggested that it was written from Athens. In fact, the postscript after the book is going to say it was written from Athens. But that after the book is something which man added that's not inspired. That's an uninspired postscript. And so that demonstrates what thought has been through the centuries, what was probably generally early accepted as far as where he had written it, when he was written it, had written it, things of that nature. But it's possible that it's being written during this year and a half that he was in Corinth. We see that it's also during his time in Corinth that he meets Aquila and Priscilla. Acts 18:2 and 3, "Found a certain Jew named Aquila, born in Pontus, lately come from Italy, with his wife Priscilla, because that Claudius had commanded all Jews to depart from Rome, and came unto them, and because he was of the same craft, he abode with them and wrought," or worked, "for by their occupation they were tent makers." We mentioned earlier in our study that one of the temptations that the Thessalonians had was not to work because they thought that the return of Jesus might be imminent. Well, Paul says that he had labored among them. He had worked. He hadn't eaten other men's bread for naught. Well, that was his practice especially where there was any question about his motivation. And we see that the reason that he was so close to Aquila and Priscilla is because they could work together, both being from a Jewish background, both being of the same craft, tent makers. It's during this time that Gallio was proconsul in Corinth. We know from archaeological inscriptions that Gallio was indeed in Corinth. We know from the secular record that he was there in AD 51 and 52. In Acts 18, 12 through 17, we read about Paul's appearing before Gallio, which must be during this time. And when Gallio was the deputy of Achaia, the Jews made insurrection with one accord against Paul and brought him to the judgment seat, saying, "This fellow persuadeth men to worship God contrary to the law." And when Paul was now about to open his mouth, Gallio said unto the Jews, "If it were a matter of wrong or wicked lewdness, O ye Jews, reason would that I should bear with you. But if it be a question of words and names and of your law, look ye to it, for I will be no judge of such." And he drave them from the judgment seat. Then all the Greeks took Sosthenes, the chief ruler of the synagogue, and beat him before the judgment seat, and Gallio cared for none of these things. If you go to Corinth today, you can stand before that very judgment seat, that bema, which is located on an intersection of two of the main streets of Corinth. And you can be there where these events took place in AD 51 or AD 52. It's amazing to be able to see the name Gallio, to be able to stand before that judgment seat, and to picture Paul being before that man in this very location. Well, Paul would have appeared then before Gallio sometime around AD 51, certainly no later than 52. Then he's going to be writing Galatians around the same time. The one indication that we surely have regarding the timing of this event is that this is definitely after the council or conference in Jerusalem, because he's going to be referring to that. Galatians 2, 1 through 14. So it's very possible that Galatians was written during the second missionary journey and probably while he was at Corinth. Paul and Silas are going to then return from their second missionary journey around this time, shortly after leaving Corinth. They're going to stop back at Ephesus and go on towards Caesarea and then back up to Antioch in Syria. Shortly thereafter, Paul is going to begin his third journey. This is going to be not long after the second journey, probably within just months of the second journey, maybe even as early as AD 51, maybe 52. We read about this journey in Acts 18:23 through Acts 21:15. The third missionary journey is going to carry Paul back through areas that he's already been and then into some new areas. He's going to go from Antioch in Syria to the regions of Galatia and Phrygia, to Ephesus, which he had visited on the second, to Macedonia, to Greece, back to Macedonia, pardon me, to Philippi, to Troas, to Assos, which was located in Mysia, and either to or by the islands of Mytilene and Chios and Samos and Trogyllium Miletus and Kos, which was on Asia's Aegean coast. He's going to go to the island of Rhodes in the Aegean, to Patara in Lycia, to Tyre in Phoenicia, and then down to Ptolemais in Judea, and then to Caesarea and to Jerusalem. Now, on the map there, you see that this journey is depicted by the dots, the very small dots that aren't broken. The second missionary journey was the complete line, the line which had no breaks in it. And as we mentioned earlier, the first journey was the longer lines and then some dots, longer line, dot, longer line, dot. I might call you to note while that chart is up there that the journey to Rome, when he's going to actually be taken to prison, that it is represented by the plus signs, and the lost journeys or the last journeys are those journeys which we don't really have a particular understanding of where he went when, but we do know that he went to some of these places. Those are going to be highlighted by just the dashed lines with no other breaks, no other symbols. So this completes the third missionary journey of Paul. What took place during that journey? Well, during that journey, sometime between AD 51 and 53 or 52 and 54, somewhere during that time, Paul's going to be in Ephesus. Acts 19:1 and Acts 20:31 show us that he's there for a period of 3 years. It's likely during that time that he wrote the book of Romans. We've included in the class notes some scriptures that help us to get some of the idea of when these are being written. We won't necessarily refer to these at this point. It's also around this time that he writes 1st and 2nd Corinthians. These letters will be one very quickly followed by the next, because the one includes a call to repentance. The second involves the fact that they had listened to that plea to repent. Around AD 53, 54, maybe even 55, Paul is going to return to Jerusalem to end that third missionary journey. When he returns to Jerusalem, sometime in that period, maybe around AD 54, he's going to be apprehended. Remember that we mentioned in an earlier class that he was blamed for having brought Gentiles into the temple. We read about that between Acts 21:27 and 22:30. He's going to be carried from there to Caesarea Maritima, Acts 23:33 through 35, where he's going to remain for a couple of years, sometime between AD 54 and 57. It's during this time that Festus begins to be procurator of Judea, around 56, or definitely from 56, that's when his reign certainly began, to around AD 60. And Paul's going to be carried to Rome during that time period and imprisoned there for a couple of years. That journey to Rome, if we look at a map again, we see described in Acts 27:1 through Acts 28:16. That journey is going to take him from Caesarea on the western coast of Judea to Sidon, which was in Phoenicia. Famed Tyre and Sidon were great cities that are mentioned in the Old Testament. To Myra, which was located in Lycia. To the Fair Havens and Lycia in Crete. To Melita, the island in the Mediterranean. To Syracuse in Sicily. Of course, this is the journey in which shipwreck is going to be suffered. That will then go to, after Syracuse in Sicily, to Rhegium, to Puteoli, to Apii Forum, as he approached Rome, to the Three Taverns, and then to Rome itself. It's during his time in Rome that he's going to write what we call the prison epistles. Ephesians is going to be written sometime around 57 through 59, as are Philippians and Colossians and Philemon. And if Paul wrote Hebrews, Hebrews would probably have been written around the same time. If we look one more time at our map of our missionary journeys, we'll see that Paul takes some more missionary journeys. These are spoken of in Romans 15:19, Titus 3:12, and those are demonstrated with just the dashed line. These journeys are going to take him such places as Dalmatia and Epirus and Illyricum, places that are located to the northwest of Greece. But we don't know the exact order of his travels or anything along that line. It's going to be during this time, before his second imprisonment, that he's going to be writing 1 Timothy around AD 60 to 63, and Titus shortly thereafter around 63 to 67. Titus was in Crete when Paul wrote to him, Titus 1:5, but by 2 Timothy 4:10, Titus is going to be in Dalmatia, to the northwest of Greece. Paul was then imprisoned under Nero, and this would be his second imprisonment in Rome, and this would be, according to tradition and apparently a valid historical record, when he was put to death. Just before his death, he writes 2 Timothy, around AD 67, and his death would have occurred sometime around AD 68. Well, that's the missionary work and the chronology of Paul. We want to move our focus then to another one of those who is given credit for writing this book. We noticed in 1 Thessalonians 1, Paul said, Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus. Well, let's consider for a few minutes Silvanus or Silas. Silas is going to also be known as Silvanus. The name Silvanus means wood. Now, we have this name in our language today. We have, for instance, the words Transylvania, across the woods, and Pennsylvania, Penn's woods. That's all that Silvanus or Silas means. His name means wood. We had there a moment ago a chart that demonstrated a number of things. We'll refer back to that chart when we get done talking about Silas. We're not necessarily going to be building with this chart the way that we built with the one on Paul, since there aren't as many elements. Well, let's see what we can learn from Scripture about this Silas. In Acts 15:22, we see that he was a chief and chosen and trusted man among the brethren in Jerusalem. This verse reads, Then pleased it the apostles and elders with the whole church to send chosen men of their own company to Antioch with Paul and Barnabas, namely Judas, surnamed Barsabbas, and Silas, chief men among the brethren. So Silas is a man who has a great reputation. We learn further in that chapter, Acts 15:32, that he was a prophet. He was an exhorting prophet. And Judas and Silas, being prophets also themselves, exhorted the brethren with many words and confirmed them. And then we see still further down in that chapter, in verse 40, that he became a co-worker of Paul. And Paul chose Silas and departed, being recommended by the brethren unto the grace of God. One will remember that on that second missionary journey, Barnabas and Paul separated ways. Barnabas and John Mark going into Cyprus, Paul then going with Silas. We see that Silas was a preacher, 2 Corinthians 1:19. For the Son of God, Jesus Christ, who was preached among you by us, even by me and Silvanus and Timotheus, was not yea and nay, but in him was yea. So he was a faithful preacher and missionary, as Paul had been. But likewise, as Paul, Silas was a sufferer. He was persecuted. In Acts 16:19-24, we read about the persecution, the suffering, which they endured when they were in Philippi. And when her masters saw that the hope of their gain was gone, they caught Paul and Silas and drew them into the marketplace unto the rulers, and brought them to the magistrates, saying, These men, being Jews, do exceedingly trouble our city, and teach customs which are not lawful for us to receive, neither to observe, being Romans. And the multitude rose up together against them, and the magistrates rent off their clothes, and commanded to beat them. And when they had laid many stripes upon them, they cast them into prison, charging the jailer to keep them safely, who, having received such a charge, thrust them into the inner prison, and made their feet fast in the stocks. This is going to be an especially important event as far as the New Testament is concerned, not simply because we learn about the conversion of the Philippian jailer, who, with his family, were baptized by Paul and Silas, but because this demonstrated that Silas was willing to pay the same type of costs that Paul was willing to pay, and that when he got to Thessalonica, getting there under duress, he was able to share with them some of the things which they certainly would ultimately be enduring themselves, since that church was one that would be persecuted. In 1 Peter 5:12, we learn something else about Silas, that he was a faithful brother, but also a letter carrier. This, Peter says, is by Silvanus, a faithful brother unto you, as I suppose, I have written briefly, exhorting and testifying that this is the true grace of God wherein ye stand. So he's going to be a letter carrier. He's going to be one who's taking the message from Peter to those who are his audience. A couple of other things we learn about Silas is that he was a Roman citizen. We've referred to Acts 16:37. Paul said they have beaten us, Paul and Silvanus, openly uncondemned, being Romans. And so like Paul, he was a Roman citizen, and we see in Acts 17:15 that he was a servant, undoubtedly a very faithful servant. And they that conducted Paul brought him unto Athens, and receiving a commandment unto Silas and Timotheus for to come to him with all speed, they departed. Well, he would serve Paul. As we look again at the chart regarding Silas, we see that he was also known as Silvanus. He was a chief, chosen, and trusted man among the brethren in Jerusalem. He was an exhorting prophet. He was a co-worker of Paul. He was a preacher, a sufferer, a faithful brother and letter carrier, a Roman citizen, and a servant. And of course, from our text, we learn that he was one of those responsible for this first letter to Thessalonians, and as we'll see in 2 Thessalonians 1:1, the second as well. We also see in 1 Thessalonians 1:1 that Timothy wrote unto them, Paul and Silvanus and Timotheus. Let's consider for a few minutes these things regarding Timothy. And like Silas, we won't take time to build upon all of these, but we do want to get this overview of who he was. Timothy was also known as Timotheus, which means honored or valued of God or honor or valuing God. He was from either Lystra or Derbe. He was taught by his mother Eunice and his grandmother Lois. We'll have more to say on their names later in our study. His father was a Greek. He was apparently converted, Timothy was, on Paul's first journey, and he was taught by Paul. He was circumcised, as we mentioned earlier, for his influence sake, so that he might be able to have a positive effect upon the Jews. He was relatively young, even as Paul's death approached, maybe around 35 years old. As we move to the second chart regarding Timothy, we see that he was Paul's son in the faith. He traveled with Paul. He was left at Ephesus by Paul. He was sent to Thessalonica by Paul while Paul remained at Athens. He was sent to Philippi. He was sent to Corinth. He was physically frail and weak in confidence at times. But ultimately, when he was called to the dying Paul, it demonstrated the faith that Paul had in him. As we look more closely at these things and consider some of the verses about them, we're going to recognize that Timothy is one who is well able to work alongside Paul and Silas with reference to the church at Thessalonica. He's going to be able to serve in the same sort of ways that they did. And he's going to be able to, as Paul and Silas could, empathize with them because he would suffer like things over time. When we get back to our study in the next class, we're going to look more closely at Timothy. And after we've done that, we'll review his life, and then we will go into other aspects regarding the introduction to the book of 1 Thessalonians, including the origin, date, keys, lessons, and things of that nature. Then we'll get into the book itself.